Hey y'all! Today we're here to do Harper's labor and delivery story. So I thought, who better to be my little co-star today than Harper herself? If you haven't already watched the labor and delivery vlog, which is going to be different than this sit down today, then you can see the little card that's at the top of the screen, or it's down in the description box below. After watching that video, it gives you a pretty good overview of what happened throughout my labor process and how it ended, but I also thought that it was really important to give a little bit of context and backstory and explain a little bit more what happened prior to my labor, during my labor, and for Harper's birth. So I was due on March 15th of this year, 2017. And about 3 weeks prior to my due date, I had started what is something that's called prodromal labor. Prodromal labor, or for some people, is false labor. There's all kinds of words for it. But basically, it's labor that has contractions. They may be consistent. They may be timeable. However, they never go anywhere. The difference between prodromal labor and real labor is that cervical change is made. You know, I was feeling pretty uncomfortable and I was pretty anxious. And so my midwife and I came up with a plan that included acupuncture, membrane sweeping, lots of walking, and trying lots of old wives' tales. I went to acupuncture 3 times a week and it did literally nothing but give me contractions that would start but never go anywhere. We did membrane sweeping and that basically did the same thing. I was soft, I was nice and ripe, and when she would sweep my membranes, it would cause for me to have some contractions. They were timeable, they seemed to be making some progress, but then I would go to sleep and they would peter out. My due date came and it went. And I was over it. I felt like this baby should come either on time or early, and she did neither of those things. I had started to get a little anxious. My midwife was coming over and giving me sweeps, and I was just really ready to get the process started and to meet this little cutie. At almost 41 weeks, I decided that I'd had enough and that I wanted to do castor oil. Now, as someone who works in the birth community, I know that it's very controversial, and please consult your midwife first. This is not a how-to video on how to do the castor oil shake, but if it's something that you're interested in, please talk to your care provider and find out about information on how to do it. And that's exactly what I did. Even though I have training as a midwife, I have training as a doula, I wanted to get the go-ahead from my midwife, and she gave me a recipe, and I took the concoction the morning that my mom was supposed to be coming into town. I went to go pick up my mom from the airport, and as we were driving back home, I started to feel sick. I had to hurry up and pull off to the side, and I upchucked the entire shake. I had only had it in my system for about an hour. Quite frankly, I was pissed because it didn't taste good. And then I had to chug it down, and then I threw it up. So I'm thinking nothing is going to happen. I'm irritated. I'm just going to go home and lay down. So I went home, I laid down, I had a nap. And when Krista got off of work, we all met at the beach so that we could go and take my last maternity pictures. Hey, I'm over 40 weeks. I'm feeling like crap, literally. That's also a side effect of the castor oil. And I said, I want to go do something to make myself feel better and just to also capture, what a pregnant body looks like after 40 weeks. And I noticed while we were there at the beach that I was having these contractions that felt pretty intense. When you're going through prodromal labor, you just have contractions all the time. And some of them are intense and some of them are just these annoying Braxton Hicks type tightenings. But I noticed when I was at the beach, oh, these are feeling a little intense. I'm having to stop taking pictures and try to breathe through them. But I had also had some earlier false labor that felt the same way, so I didn't think anything about it. I remember on the drive home, I felt so uncomfortable. A lot of the drive home is pretty fuzzy to me because I was having to close my eyes and breathe through the contractions. We had decided that we were gonna all get something to eat, and I decided that I wanted a gyro. And so we got that, and I remember being in the car and feeling like it took Krista forever to get this gyro because I was having contractions that were coming at this point every 6 minutes or so, and they were intense. I was having to breathe through them. Well, if that wasn't torture enough, my mom and Riley decided that they did not want to have a gyro. They actually wanted to have, I think, Ivar's, which is a fish place up here. And so we went across the street to Ivar's, and my mom was going to take Riley to an art show. Riley's work was featured in an art show at school. And so my mom was going to take her back to the art show. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what is taking them so long? I feel like I am dying in this car. But I did not want to say that this was the real deal because there have been so many stops and starts throughout the past couple of weeks. So it was Krista and I that went back home. My mom and Riley went on to the art show. Once we got home, when Krista and I arrived home from getting food, I got out of the car and we had been at the beach and there's water, obviously. So I just assumed that the dress that I had on had just drug through the water at some point, and it's a different kind of material. So I just assumed that it hadn't dried. But then I noticed, I was like, it's not where you would think that the water would have ran, which would have been on my feet. It was kind of, towards the back area. And so we turn around and I feel the seat, and lo and behold, we said, okay, I think this might actually be my water breaking. So my water had broke. I was having consistent contractions and it was seeming like this was go time. And I came upstairs and I said, well, if this is it, then I want to eat and I want to try to keep things going because as soon as I lay down, the contractions are going to stop. And I don't want that. These feel pretty intense. So I got upstairs and I got on my birth ball and I ate my food and I did my hip circles and the contractions just kept coming. I just kept doing the work, and as you'll see if you've watched the labor and delivery vlog, the labor and delivery vlog starts hours after the eating dinner basically. It starts in the middle of the night once I was really in what felt like strong active labor. For those of you who don't know, active labor, or the time that you should call your doula or your midwife or go to the hospital, is something called 511. And that varies based on how many babies you've had, and if you've already had babies before, how fast you have your babies. And basically the short version is that it is contractions that are 5 minutes apart, lasting at least a minute for over an hour. So the labor and delivery vlog actually picks up what my contractions are about at that point. And you guys will hear in that vlog that Krista said that we should call Trina, who was our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful doula. And so I was starting to feel like I couldn't get a handle on the contractions at that point. If you guys notice in that video, there's a caption that just says, I can't seem to, I think it says something, I can't get a hold of them or I can't stay on top of them. And I was feeling really out of my body and feeling a little out of control. I called my doula over. She came over, and as you guys saw from the video, she was amazing. She provided all of the physical hands-on support and also a lot of the emotional support throughout the birthing process. Sometime within that labor la land, as time progressed on, Trina suggested that I call my midwife. And so my midwife came over. She also wanted to come over and check me because my water had broke. She also wanted to come over because I was GBS positive. So my midwife wanted to come over and get an idea of where I was as far as progress and to also administer my first set of antibiotics. And she texted me, and I want to say that I was probably at about a 4. I had been at a 2 for the weeks prior to that, but I had also been thinning out a lot and I had been softening, which are also very important components of labor and delivery. It's not just cervical dilation, which everyone is so focused on. She had decided that she was just going to stay because I seemed to be making good progress and I seemed to be progressing well, and I seemed to be having strong, consistent contractions. So everybody decided it was time to hunker in and that this was the real deal. As you guys saw throughout the labor vlog, it was a tough labor process. It was almost 30 hours of laboring. Throughout that point, I also had an IV to kind of help perk me up. Bless you. to kind of help perk me up and give me some energy. The fluids definitely helped, but at this point I was not interested in eating anything, and I was just primarily drinking water, which are pretty big no-nos. If I was managing a birth, I would have cautioned myself that I needed to be eating food, which is something that I wasn't doing at that point. Once your uterus is contracting every 5 minutes, the last thing you want to do is eat food. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to chew. So that at that point, they started kind of spoon feeding me honey in between contractions to help kind of keep up my energy. At this point, fast forward to probably about the 24-hour mark. In the video, you'll notice that in the window, you'll see the sun start to come up, and I was feeling pretty discouraged at that point. I was hoping that my body had made better progress. Even though I was trying for a VBAC, I felt confident that I had dilated to complete with my first daughter, and I had also delivered our son, who was stillborn, Grayson, vaginally. In my brain, I was thinking, piece of cake. The hard part will not be labor dilation. It will be actually pushing or something else. But for some reason, Harper was not engaging in the birth canal. And so in the video, you'll see that we used a rebozo, which I also reference in the video is a Mexican shawl. It is used in Mexican and Latin cultures for many different things that start at birth, and folks are even wrapped in it in their death. But basically, my midwife had an African version of the rebozo that we used to help try to pull the baby in closer, which would hopefully encourage her to descend and kind of drop down into the pelvis. That wasn't working, but I was starting to dilate more. So my midwife checked me, and then she told me that it was okay for me to get in the birth pool. Now, one of the things about a birth pool is that there's lots of water. Water does enter your body because your skin is made of cells, and they have all kinds of channels that allow for water in and water out. And oxytocin is something that flows through the body that helps give you contractions, and it's the love hormone, and it does all kinds of other wonderful things. But when you introduce water into an environment that's saturated with oxytocin, the water can dilute the oxytocin, which in turn can cause your contractions to slow down or stop. And unfortunately, that's what happened for me. The birth pool was also a big wake-up call for me. As someone who had planned to have a water birth and had invested a lot of time, energy, and just mental preparation work on having a water birth, I had no idea that a water birth was actually not going to take away as much of the pain as I had anticipated that it would. The water allowed for me to be able to have some good sleep in between. It allowed for me to be buoyant and kind of float and take some of that weight that's there. But it also diluted my oxytocin, and my contractions started getting farther and farther apart. My midwife at that point decided that it was a good idea for me to get out of the birth tub, that I needed to get back up, get some gravity going. I had had a little bit of a rest, and I agreed that it was a good idea. I got dressed and I started doing stair lunges, which are good for helping the baby drop into the pelvis and for getting contractions going again. Trina and I did that for about 30 minutes or so, and then we switched it up, and I went and got on my birth ball, and that's when you'll see that we're downstairs in the living room. To also get my labor going, we did a lot of dancing, a lot of twerking. My birth mix was one of the most well-rounded, probably odd birth mixes around. I had two separate ones. One I call the Ratchet Birth Mix, which had all of my music from Atlanta and all my music from New Orleans, primarily bounce music, Big Frida, Sissy Nobi, all these other people who I knew were gonna kind of like get me excited and make me want to dance. And then I also had these like really sentimental songs and R&B and neo soul, and those were all supposed to serve as backups for my Hypno Babies course. Now, I can do a completely separate review of the Hypno Babies course, but let's just say that while it provided me with good preparation for the labor process, and it was good in early labor. For me personally, it did not work when it came to being really, really difficult and hard in my labor process. I actually wanted to scream listening to the recordings, and that was difficult for me because I had spent my entire pregnancy preparing for hypnobabies, and I'm so happy that I had the foresight to hire Trina to also assist me, because I probably would have went to the hospital within the first maybe 8 to 10 hours of labor, because I wouldn't have been able to have someone there to provide me with physical support. Once we were downstairs doing hip circles, dancing, laughing, eating, recharging, my contractions just weren't coming. And the contractions that I was having were incredibly painful. And my midwife had said that, you know, I was at this point at a 7, but baby hadn't necessarily, she was lower in the pelvis but hadn't engaged all the way in the pelvis. And so long story short, we made the decision that it would be best for me to go to the hospital, not only because I had been in labor for almost 30 hours, but at this point I was ready to go to sleep. I wanted to go to the hospital, get an epidural, sleep, and then wake up and be ready to push out a baby. Because 9 times out of 10, that's how it works with home births. Most people are not going to the hospital because of a complication. They're going because they need some therapeutic sleep, which can be given from an epidural, or, you know, maybe baby's in a wrong position, or contractions have petered out and you need a little bit of Pitocin. That's what I was planning on going to the hospital for. When we got to the hospital, that is not what happened. Unfortunately, the backup OB that I had been seeing was on call that night but was not working in the hospital. So I actually had to see somebody that's called a hospitalist. And that's a doctor who does not have an outside practice. Their entire job is to work in the hospital, and they are the doctor just there in the hospital. Well, this hospitalist was very clearly against home birth and VBACs. Because Washington State is a progressive birth community, I expected for things to be different. I expected for there to be some understanding, but apparently because I had had 2 cesareans, she was not comfortable with me laboring at all, and she was ready to cut me as soon as I basically walked in the door. Well, my midwife up until this point had been one of the most favorite people in my entire life. She would come here to our home and provide my midwife services. All of my prenatal visits were done right here in my home. She had done my blessing way, which was an amazing experience. And at my house for my laboring process, she was great. When we went to the hospital, if I've never seen anyone in my entire life do a faster 180 than her, yeah, that's what happened. She basically started to side with the doctors, and not because there was any concern to my baby, but I think that she wanted to try to, at that point, save her own. And I don't want to badmouth her, and that's one of the reasons why I've tried to keep her pictures and not identified who she is in the video, because she is a lovely person, she is a wonderful person, but the experience that we had once we got to the hospital was something that I would never wish on anyone. When you're in labor, it's one of the most vulnerable times of your life. And the last thing you want to do is have to fight with the hospital staff about your wishes. But to fight with someone who you have trusted and loved and cared for your entire pregnancy and prior to this, is someone that you respect, and have to also fight them because they're more concerned with what the birth community or medical community is going to think of them, and not necessarily the wishes of their client, was incredibly disappointing. The other important thing to note is that I sent my doula home. She had been up for a really long time, and I wanted her to go home and rest and then come down after my plan of having an epidural, getting some sleep, and being ready to push out a baby. So unfortunately, my super #1 advocate wasn't able to be there, and so I expected for my midwife to fill that role, and she just didn't, which is incredibly sad. Let me preface that also by saying Harper never was in any signs of distress. I was never showing any signs of infection, and typically the way birth things go is if mama's okay, if baby's okay, then birth should be able to continue, and I wasn't provided with that opportunity, and that's what I'm upset about. If there was an emergency of any type, then we were done. We were going for a C-section. I would not have argued that. But if I wanted to have to fight with someone, if I wanted to be immediately cut open, I would have never hired her. I would have gone straight to the hospital and had a repeat C-section at 37 weeks. The long and short of that is that she did help me after realizing that I was pissed. She did help me try to get baby in a good position, get contractions going again. But the hospital at this point would not allow me to have an epidural. They told me no, I could not have an epidural because I needed to have a C-section. So the doctors basically said, well, you figure out whatever it is that you want to do, and I'm going to be back in this amount of time, and you better have made progress or you're done. And eventually I had to kick my midwife out. Not going to get into the details of that, but I felt like she wasn't supporting my decisions and I just couldn't deal with that anymore. A few hours after that, the OB on call that I was actually supposed to be seeing came in and checked me, never told me what my progress was. The last time the hospitalist had checked me, I was at an 8. He checked me, basically said, nope, we're doing this, and said that we were going to have a C-section. Consent form shoved in my face. They then at that point were willing to consent to give me an epidural, and we went on to the OR. And I barely was able to even get out my wishes for a C-section. If you notice in the pictures, I had a clear drape. I barely had the time to say, I want a clear drape. I don't want my arm strapped down, because they were in such a rush. And when I looked at the clock, I noticed that's because it was 7 o'clock. It was time for a shift change, and he was probably ready to be off call, and the hospitalist was ready to be off call, but they also wanted to get that money. Because if they change shifts, then the doctor that just came on would do my cesarean or my delivery, and they would get that money. Side note, my bill for this cesarean was over $58,000 versus the cost of a home birth, which would have been around $3,300, give or take. Once the C-section got started, then everything kind of went into slow motion for me. I started to get nervous because in previous C-sections I have had trouble breathing, and I don't necessarily think that it's a anesthesia thing. I think that it's a nerves thing. I have chronic anxiety and all kinds of other things that you can learn about in my depression video. Definitely not a plug though for that. Yeah. I get really nervous when it's time to have a C-section because it's major surgery, and so many care providers just make it seem like it's this really simple procedure, and it's almost like, you know, maybe the equivalent of getting stitches or something else, and I don't think people realize that it is in fact major surgery. Stepping off my soapbox now. After the C-section, they got her out rather quickly. The doctor did hold her there for probably about 30 seconds or so, put her up against the little plastic drape so we could see her. I think that he was doing that A, so we could see her, and B, so that she could have some delayed cord clamping, which was amazing. They did not wipe her off all the way. When they started to, I was like, I don't want her wiped. I leave her. Like, I want all the bloody vernix, all the other stuff I wanted on her. Just give me my baby. They put her on me skin to skin, and I tried to do a little bit of breastfeeding in the OR, but it was pretty impossible, and she wasn't necessarily interested right then and there anyway. This cesarean for me was the best out of the 3 that I had had. I was able to be awake. I don't know if maybe they did something different with the morphine or the medication, but I wasn't as groggy in the recovery room. I was able to be awake and remember breastfeeding her after the birth and being able to laugh and take pictures and other things. Some of the pictures that you see in the birth vlog, I took themselves, and that really says a lot about how doped up I was. So we spent our first night in the hospital, and it was an experience to say the least. Anyone who's ever been in a hospital knows that they come in and out over and over throughout the night, and that is their job, is to make sure that you're safe and that your baby is safe, and that if you need anything, and to check your vitals and to make sure you're not bleeding to death in the hospital. But for me, it was overkill. And so by the next morning, I was just kind of over it. Harper was born at around 6:47 in the morning, and so we got some rest when we came back. We spent the entire day there. We spent the first night, and the next morning, which was a Sunday, I woke up and said, get me the hell out of here. I asked the nurse, what can I do to be able to go home? For most C-sections, you're in the hospital for about 3 days, and to have someone ask after 24 hours if they could go home is kind of unheard of. But Harper was fine. She had the GBS antibiotics that she needed. She was showing zero signs of infection. My incision looked great. My bleeding was great. I also was not showing any signs of infection. And so they gave us the go ahead. We said, great. They gave us our discharge papers and we were out. And I know some people are probably going to watch this and be like, oh my gosh, you were such a Debbie Downer. Was there any part of your labor or birth that was good? And there were lots of parts of my labor and birth that were wonderful. I got to be home. I got to labor in my home for over 30 hours. I got to be in a birth tub, which is exactly what I wanted to do. I got to be surrounded by people that I love, including my 4.5-year-old daughter. So many people kick their children out of the birthing room because they think that it's inappropriate or that it's too much for kids to handle, and she completely rose to the occasion. I got to listen to the music that I wanted to. I got to twerk in my house to help my baby come out. I got to be loved up on by my wife. And so there were many things about my birth, but I also think that there's too many people that are always sugarcoating what labor and birth is supposed to be, especially natural labor and birth. When I was preparing for my birth, I can't tell you the number of inspirational birthing videos I would watch to get myself ready to go. And they primarily were like these wonderful, happy, everything went exactly the way that I wanted it to. And while some people's births are like that, I also want it to be known that some people's births aren't, and that is okay. It is okay to have a surgical birth or a C-section. It is okay to have a home birth. It's okay to have a hospital birth. It's okay to have a hospital birth and walk in and want an epidural. Every single birth has an impact on our life, and everybody has to do exactly what works for them, and it's not anyone else's place to judge that. So thanks so much for watching. Again, if you haven't watched our birth vlog, if you're watching this one first, be sure to click the link below or at the end of the video to watch the labor and delivery vlog. And I apologize also for the sound quality of the video. When I edited it, it was fine. When it went up on YouTube, it was wonky. So I apologize for that, but thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you for part 3 of our labor and delivery vlog, which talks about how things are going postpartum and about our future plans for future children. We'll see you in our next vlog. Bye.